No one will want to marry a second-hand used woman like you, husband mocked ex-wife. But, distinguished viewers, welcome to Luxury True Life Stories. Please like and subscribe for more amazing real-life luxury stories. Now, let's get into the story. Sophia Robinson grew up in a quiet, well-ordered home shaped by discipline and quiet ambition. Her father, Daniel Robinson, a civil engineer, believed everything in life should be structured and stable, while her mother, Evelyn Robinson, a literature teacher, nurtured Sophia's imagination through books and gentle guidance. Between them, Sophia became both thoughtful and resilient, learning to see beyond what existed into what could be created. Unlike others her age, she found joy in sketching spaces, imagining how empty rooms could be transformed into something meaningful and alive. As she grew older, Sophia developed a deep passion for interior architecture, not just as a profession but as a way to restore broken environments and, in a way, broken lives. She was drawn to abandoned buildings, neglected corners, and forgotten spaces, believing that with care and vision, anything could be rebuilt. While her peers chased trends and attention, Sophia quietly focused on mastering her craft, spending long hours studying design, textures, and structure, determined to build a future defined by purpose rather than approval. Despite her calm strength, Sophia carried a quiet desire to be seen and understood beyond her achievements. She dreamed of a life where her work mattered and where love would be built on respect and depth, not appearances. Standing on the edge of adulthood, she had no idea that her journey would soon lead her into a relationship that would test everything she believed about love, self-worth, and the true meaning of rebuilding from nothing. Timothy Collins grew up in a world entirely different from Sophia's, one where appearances mattered more than substance and success was measured by how loudly it could be displayed. His father, Gregory Collins, was a high-ranking corporate executive known for his ruthless decisions, while his mother, Patricia Collins, moved effortlessly through elite social circles, teaching Timothy early that reputation was everything. From a young age, Timothy learned that being ordinary was unacceptable. He had to stand out, dominate, and be admired. Failure, in his household, was not a lesson, it was a disgrace. As he matured, Timothy developed a sharp mind for strategy and persuasion, excelling in business and social influence. He knew how to speak, how to impress, and most importantly, how to position himself in rooms that mattered. However, beneath his confidence was a constant need for validation, a quiet fear of being overlooked or insignificant. He surrounded himself with people who elevated his image, carefully curating every aspect of his life to reflect success. To him, relationships were not just emotional connections, they were extensions of status, tools that either enhanced or diminished his standing. By the time he entered university, Timothy had already set his sights on a future filled with power, wealth, and recognition. He didn't believe in slow growth or quiet dreams, he believed in rapid success and visible achievement. Love, to him, was something that needed to align with ambition, not interfere with it. He had no idea that soon, he would meet someone who didn't fit into his carefully constructed world, someone whose quiet strength would both attract him, eventually, challenge everything he thought he understood about control, value, and worth. The university's annual design exhibition was alive with energy, filled with students eager to display their work and be recognized. Sophia Robinson stood quietly beside her presentation, a carefully detailed restoration concept of an abandoned cultural center, her designs thoughtful and deeply human. While others used bold colors and dramatic ideas to draw attention, Sophia's work spoke in a quieter language, subtle, intentional, and deeply moving. People who stopped by didn't just see a design, they felt something they couldn't easily explain. Still, she remained composed, answering questions calmly, never seeking the spotlight. Timothy Collins arrived at the exhibition not out of passion for design, but because he understood the importance of being seen at events like this. Moving confidently through the crowd, he observed projects with a critical eye, more interested in people than the work itself. Then he stopped. Sophia's display was different. It wasn't loud or attention-seeking, yet it held him there longer than anything else. What caught him even more was Sophia herself, her quiet confidence, the way she spoke without trying to impress, the depth in her explanations. She wasn't trying to stand out, yet she naturally did. When Timothy approached her, their conversation began simply, but it quickly deepened. He asked sharp questions, expecting surface-level answers, but Sophia responded with insight and clarity that surprised him. For the first time in a long while, Timothy felt challenged, not in a competitive way, but in a way that made him curious. Sophia, on the other hand, noticed his confidence and presence, but also sensed something guarded beneath it. Neither of them realized it then, but that brief encounter, unexpected and unplanned, would mark the beginning of a connection that would grow into something powerful, complicated, and ultimately life-changing. After their first meeting, Timothy found reasons to see Sophia again, often appearing where he knew she would be, turning coincidence into intention. What began as brief conversations slowly turned into long walks across campus, quiet cafe discussions, and late evenings spent exchanging ideas about life, ambition, and purpose. Sophia was drawn to his confidence and clarity, while Timothy found himself intrigued by her depth and calm presence. For once, he wasn't leading every interaction, he was listening, observing, and learning. Their connection grew steadily, built on shared conversations rather than grand gestures. Timothy introduced Sophia to his fast-paced world, while Sophia introduced him to stillness, the kind that allowed reflection rather than performance. She didn't try to impress him, and that alone set her apart from anyone he had ever known. For Sophia, Timothy felt like possibility, someone who could expand her world beyond her quiet beginnings. For Timothy, Sophia was different, unpredictably grounding, yet not easily controlled. Yet beneath the surface, small differences began to form. Timothy valued recognition and visibility, often speaking about success in terms of status, while Sophia believed in purpose and impact over appearance. These differences were subtle at first, almost invisible within the warmth of their growing love. Neither of them addressed it, choosing instead to focus on what felt right in the moment. What they didn't realize was that these quiet contrasts, left unspoken, were slowly laying the foundation for a future conflict neither of them was prepared for. As their relationship deepened, Timothy became more intentional, no longer content with casual moments and passing conversations. He began to include Sophia in his plans, speaking about the future with a certainty that made everything feel secure and inevitable. He introduced her to his world, formal gatherings, high-profile connections, and spaces where influence carried weight. Sophia, though initially out of place, carried herself with quiet grace, earning admiration not through display, but through authenticity. Timothy saw how others noticed her, and for a moment, he felt proud, not just of her presence, but of what she represented beside him. The proposal came unexpectedly, yet with a sense of precision that reflected Timothy's nature. It wasn't overly dramatic, but it was deliberate, planned to perfection. In a quiet, elegant setting overlooking the city, he asked Sophia to marry him, speaking of partnership, growth, and a shared future built on success. Sophia, moved by the sincerity in his words and the journey they had shared, said yes without hesitation. To her, it wasn't about the setting or the status, it was about the belief that together, they could build something meaningful. Their wedding was refined and carefully curated, reflecting Timothy's attention to image and detail. Guests admired them, seeing what appeared to be a perfect union, ambition paired with grace, confidence balanced by depth. As Sophia stepped into her new life as Timothy Collins's wife, she carried hope, love, and the quiet determination to make their marriage work. But beneath the celebration and polished appearances, the unspoken differences between them remained, subtle, unresolved, and waiting for the moment they would no longer be ignored. Marriage brought a new rhythm to their lives, one that initially felt exciting but gradually revealed its weight. Sophia moved into Timothy's world fully now, adjusting to a life that revolved around schedules, appearances, and expectations. Their home was elegant, designed with precision, yet it lacked the warmth Sophia once imagined creating. She tried to change that, adding small touches, softening spaces, bringing life into the structure, but Timothy often dismissed these efforts as unnecessary. To him, perfection was already achieved. There was no need to alter what was already impressive. As weeks turned into months, Timothy became increasingly absorbed in his work, chasing bigger opportunities and higher recognition. Late nights became normal, conversations grew shorter, and the ease they once shared began to fade. When they did speak, it was often about his achievements, his plans, his ambitions. Sophia listened, supported, and encouraged, but she began to feel unseen, as though her presence was no longer as significant as it once was. She continued her work quietly, pouring herself into her designs, trying to hold on to her sense of purpose. The distance between them was not loud or explosive, it was quiet, gradual, and deeply unsettling. Sophia noticed the change but chose patience over confrontation, believing that love required understanding. Timothy, on the other hand, didn't see the distance as a problem. To him, it was simply part of growth, a necessary shift as he moved forward in life. Neither of them realized that what they were calling adjustment was slowly becoming disconnection, and that the foundation they once believed was strong was beginning to weaken in ways they could no longer ignore. Helen Walter entered Timothy's life with precision, not coincidence. She was already well known in elite circles, elegant, composed, and always aware of how to position herself in any room. Born into wealth, Helen had grown up surrounded by influence, but unlike others who were content with comfort, she craved control and recognition. She understood people quickly, reading their weaknesses as easily as their strengths. When she first noticed Timothy at a corporate event, she didn't just see a successful man, she saw ambition that could be shaped, redirected, and eventually dominated. Their first interaction was effortless, almost calculated in its ease. Helen spoke with intelligence and charm, mirroring Timothy's energy in a way that felt both natural and engaging. She didn't challenge him the way Sophia did. Instead, she affirmed him, praised his vision, and aligned herself with his ambitions. Timothy found this refreshing, someone who understood his drive without questioning it, someone who fits seamlessly into the image he was building. What began as casual conversations quickly turned into frequent encounters, each one drawing Timothy further into Helen's carefully constructed presence. Sophia, meanwhile, became aware of Helen not through confrontation, but through subtle changes. Timothy mentioned her name in passing at first, then more frequently, always in the context of work or networking. There was nothing openly suspicious, yet something felt different. The tone in his voice shifted when he spoke about Helen, lighter, more engaged, more alive than he had been in a long time. Sophia couldn't explain it, but she felt it, a quiet disturbance, like something important was beginning to slip beyond her reach, just before she could fully understand what it was. What began as occasional meetings between Timothy and Helen soon turned into something far more deliberate. They started scheduling private discussions under the guise of strategy sessions, choosing quiet, exclusive locations where conversations extended beyond business. Helen was careful, she never rushed, never pushed too far too quickly. Instead, she created a space where Timothy felt understood, admired, and most importantly, uninterrupted. With her, he didn't have to explain himself, she already agreed with him. Timothy found himself looking forward to those moments, justifying them as necessary connections that supported his growth. He told himself it was harmless, that it was simply alignment with someone who shared his vision. But slowly, boundaries began to blur. Conversations became more personal, laughter more frequent, and silences more comfortable. Helen began to occupy his thoughts even when he wasn't with her, her words echoing in ways Sophia's no longer did. It wasn't sudden, it was gradual, almost invisible, until it could no longer be ignored. At home, Sophia felt the shift deepen. Timothy was present, but not truly there. His attention drifted, his responses delayed, his warmth replaced by distraction. She tried to reach him, to bring back the connection they once had, but every attempt seemed to meet a wall she couldn't see or break through. Still, she held on, believing that what they had built couldn't simply disappear. What she didn't yet realize was that something had already changed, and that the line between loyalty and betrayal had quietly been crossed. Sophia did not confront Timothy immediately. Instead, she chose observation, hoping that what she sensed was temporary, something that would pass if given time. She paid attention to the small details, the late-night messages he quickly dismissed, the way his tone shifted when certain names appeared, the increasing number of important meetings that kept him away. None of it was direct evidence, yet together, it formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. Still, she held on to restraint, believing that accusations without certainty could destroy what little remained between them. Determined to save her marriage, Sophia began making quiet efforts to reconnect. She adjusted her schedule, prepared thoughtful evenings, and tried to reintroduce the warmth they once shared. She spoke gently, asked about his day, showed interest in his work, hoping to remind him of what they had built together. But each attempt seemed to fall short. Timothy responded, but without depth, present in body, absent in spirit. To him, her efforts felt unnecessary, even inconvenient, as though she was trying to hold onto something he had already begun to let go of. The silence between them grew heavier, no longer peaceful but strained, filled with unspoken truths. Sophia felt it most in the quiet moments, the pauses in conversation, the distance in shared spaces, the absence of connection where it once existed so naturally. She began to understand that this was no longer just a phase, something fundamental had shifted. And yet, even as that realization settled in, she chose not to break, not to react in anger or desperation. Instead, she stood still in the middle of uncertainty, holding on to her dignity while everything around her slowly began to fall apart. The day everything finally collapsed did not arrive with chaos, but with a cold, controlled finality that left no room for misunderstanding. Timothy asked Sophia to meet him in his office, formal, distant, and unfamiliar. The space itself felt different that day, stripped of any warmth, as though it had already decided the outcome before either of them spoke. Sophia walked in with quiet composure, her heart steady despite the storm she had long sensed approaching. She didn't ask questions immediately. She simply waited, watching him, searching for something, anything, that resembled the man she once knew. Timothy did not hesitate. His words were direct, sharp, and completely detached from emotion. He spoke of incompatibility, of growth in different directions, of the need to move forward without being held back. To him, it was a logical conclusion, something that had been building and now needed resolution. Then, without hesitation, he revealed what Sophia had already begun to suspect: he was involved with Helen. There was no apology, no attempt to soften the impact, only a quiet certainty that this decision was final. In that moment, everything Sophia had tried to preserve was reduced to something disposable. When Sophia finally spoke, her voice remained calm, but her silence carried more weight than any anger could. She asked only one question: why he never tried to fix what they had. Timothy's response was what shattered everything completely. With a cold, dismissive tone, he looked at her and said, "No one will want to marry a second-hand used woman like you." The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Sophia didn't react outwardly, no tears, no raised voice. She simply stood there, absorbing the truth of who he had become. And in that quiet moment, without saying another word, she turned and walked away, not just from the office, but from everything that no longer deserved her presence. Sophia walked out of Timothy's office with the same quiet composure she had carried in, but everything within her had shifted. The words he had spoken did not echo loudly, they settled deeply, like something heavy sinking into still water. Yet, instead of breaking her, they clarified something she had been holding onto for too long. She did not return home immediately. Instead, she went to a quiet public park, sitting alone as the world moved around her without noticing. For the first time, she allowed herself to fully accept what had happened, not just the betrayal, but the reality that the man she loved no longer existed in the form she once knew. The divorce process moved quickly, almost as if Timothy had already prepared for it long before that final conversation. Legal papers were handled efficiently, assets divided with cold precision, and communication reduced to the bare minimum. Sophia did not fight for anything beyond what was rightfully hers. She had no desire to hold on to remnants of a life that had already lost its meaning. She left the house, the shared spaces, and the carefully constructed life behind without resistance. What mattered now was not what she had lost, but what she still had, herself. In the quiet that followed, Sophia chose not to collapse under the weight of humiliation or anger. Instead, she focused on rebuilding, not externally at first, but internally. She returned to her work with renewed intention, immersing herself in projects that required focus, creativity, and vision. Each space she restored became more than just a design, it became a reflection of her own process, piece by piece, reclaiming what had been broken. She did not seek validation, revenge, or even immediate happiness. What she chose instead was something far more powerful: dignity, clarity, and the quiet beginning of becoming whole again. Sophia Robinson started again, not with noise or declarations, but with deliberate, quiet steps that carried more strength than anything she had done before. She moved into a modest apartment in a different part of the city, a space that was simple, unfinished, and entirely hers. For the first time in a long while, every decision she made belonged only to her. She redesigned the apartment slowly, not rushing the process, allowing each detail to reflect clarity rather than perfection. It wasn't about creating something impressive, it was about creating something honest. Her work began to shift as well. Sophia took on projects others overlooked: aging buildings, forgotten interiors, spaces dismissed as beyond repair. Where others saw decay, she saw potential waiting to be revealed. Her approach was no longer just technical. It became deeply intentional, almost personal. Clients began to notice the difference. Her designs carried a quiet depth that set her apart, not because they demanded attention, but because they held meaning. Without seeking recognition, Sophia began to earn it. Outside of work, her life remained calm and contained. She avoided unnecessary social spaces, choosing instead a smaller circle of genuine interactions. Among them was Clara Bennett, a documentary photographer who lived in the same building. Clara was observant, thoughtful, and drawn to stories others ignored, much like Sophia. Their friendship developed naturally, built on shared understanding rather than forced connection. Through simple conversations and quiet support, Sophia found something she had lost: ease. Not the kind that comes from comfort, but the kind that comes from knowing you no longer have to prove your worth to anyone. The invitation arrived without expectation. Sophia had been selected to redesign a historic government-owned building scheduled for restoration, a project far larger than anything she had handled alone. It was not just about design, it carried cultural and national significance. Though surprised, she accepted with quiet confidence, approaching it the same way she approached everything now, with focus and intention, not pressure. The building itself was vast, aged, and filled with history, its walls carrying stories that had long been forgotten. To Sophia, it was not intimidating, it was an opportunity. On the day of the official site inspection, the atmosphere was formal, structured, and carefully managed. Government officials, advisors, and media personnel moved through the space, each focused on their role. Sophia remained composed, studying the building rather than the people, already visualizing what it could become. It was during this inspection that she first saw him, President Richard Jackson. His presence was quiet yet commanding, not loud or attention-seeking, but impossible to ignore. He moved through the space with purpose, listening. More than speaking, observing details others overlooked. Their interaction was brief but significant. When introduced, Richard did not treat Sophia as just another contractor. He asked her about her vision, how she saw the building beyond its current state. Sophia answered honestly, speaking not just of structure, but of restoration, of preserving identity while allowing growth. There was no attempt to impress, only clarity and depth. Richard listened carefully, his interest evident not in his words, but in his attention. That short exchange lingered longer than expected, leaving behind a quiet impression neither of them chose to acknowledge immediately, but neither could ignore. Sophia approached the restoration project with the same quiet precision that had come to define her work, but this time, the stakes were higher. The building demanded more than technical skill, it required sensitivity to history, balance between preservation and renewal, and decisions that would be publicly scrutinized. She spent long hours on site, studying every detail, working closely with engineers, historians, and craftsmen. Unlike before, she was now operating in a space where every move mattered, yet she remained grounded, focused only on doing the work right. President Richard Jackson visited the site more frequently than expected, but his presence was never disruptive. He did not interfere or impose authority unnecessarily. Instead, he observed, asked thoughtful questions, and listened closely to Sophia's explanations. Over time, their conversations grew longer, not personal, but deeply respectful. He admired her clarity, the way she spoke with purpose rather than performance. Sophia, in turn, noticed his restraint, his ability to lead without dominating, something she had rarely seen before. There was no pressure between them, no hidden expectations, just mutual respect. What made their connection different was its absence of urgency. Neither of them rushed to define or deepen it beyond what it naturally was. They met within the work, spoke through ideas, and understood each other through shared values rather than emotional declarations. For Sophia, it was unfamiliar yet steady, a connection that did not demand anything from her. For Richard, it was rare, a presence that did not seek his position, only met him as he was. Without either of them realizing it fully, something strong was forming, not out of intensity, but out of quiet understanding that would soon begin to change both of their lives. Sophia's work on the restoration project began to draw attention far beyond what she expected. What started as a government assignment slowly became a symbol of thoughtful transformation, with architects, designers, and public figures recognizing the depth of her vision. The building was no longer just being repaired, it was being reimagined in a way that respected its past while giving it renewed purpose. Her name began to circulate in professional circles, not through self-promotion, but through the undeniable impact of her work. Despite the growing recognition, Sophia remained unchanged in her approach. She avoided unnecessary publicity, focusing instead on the integrity of each decision she made. Interviews were brief, her words measured, always redirecting attention back to the work rather than herself. Those who worked closely with her noticed the quiet strength she carried. There was no need to prove anything, no urgency to be validated. She had already rebuilt something far more important within herself, and that stability reflected in everything she touched. At the same time, her interactions with President Richard Jackson became more natural, no longer confined strictly to formal discussions. There was a sense of ease between them, a growing familiarity that did not feel forced or complicated. They spoke occasionally beyond the project, about ideas, leadership, and the importance of purpose. It was subtle, steady, and grounded. Sophia was no longer defined by what she had lost, she was becoming known for what she was creating. And without realizing it, her life was moving towards something entirely new, something that would soon redefine everything Timothy once believed about her. While Sophia's life was quietly stabilizing and rising, Timothy Collins found himself in a very different reality, one that looked impressive on the outside but was slowly losing its foundation. His relationship with Helen Walter had fully taken center stage, and at first, it felt exactly as he had expected, refined, aligned, and beneficial to his image. Helen fit seamlessly into his world, attending events with elegance, speaking with precision, and reinforcing the version of success Timothy wanted others to see. To outsiders, they appeared powerful and perfectly matched. But beneath that polished surface, the dynamic was far from balanced. Helen was not simply supportive, she was controlling in ways that were subtle yet undeniable. She began influencing Timothy's decisions, steering his professional choices, and isolating him from people who once had his trust. What she presented as guidance slowly became direction, and what felt like partnership began to feel like quiet dominance. Timothy, who once believed he was always in control, did not immediately recognize the shift. By the time he did, it was no longer easy to step back. At the same time, cracks began to appear in his professional life. Decisions influenced by Helen started to carry consequences: missed opportunities, strained partnerships, and growing skepticism from colleagues. The confidence that once defined him began to feel forced, his certainty replaced with underlying tension. Yet, he held on to appearances, unwilling to admit that anything was wrong. What Timothy failed to understand was that the life he had chosen, built on image rather than truth, was beginning to collapse, not all at once, but in slow, undeniable pieces he could no longer control. The first real sign of collapse came quietly, almost unnoticed at first. A major deal Timothy had spent months securing suddenly fell through, not because of external competition, but due to internal distrust. Partners who once valued his judgment began questioning his decisions, pointing out inconsistencies that had recently become too frequent to ignore. Meetings that used to end in agreement now ended in hesitation. For the first time in years, Timothy felt something unfamiliar, uncertainty creeping into spaces where confidence had always dominated. Helen, instead of offering reassurance, responded with calculated detachment. She dismissed the setbacks as temporary, yet subtly redirected blame toward Timothy's execution rather than the decisions she had heavily influenced. Her tone remained composed, but there was a growing distance in her support, as though she was already preparing to detach herself from anything that threatened her image. Timothy noticed the shift but chose to ignore it, convincing himself that maintaining control meant refusing to acknowledge weakness. As pressure mounted, Timothy's carefully constructed world began to feel unstable. Invitations became fewer, conversations less welcoming, and opportunities less certain. The respect he once commanded was no longer automatic, it had to be defended, explained, and sometimes questioned. Alone in moments he once filled with certainty, Timothy began to reflect, not out of growth, but out of necessity. And in those rare, unguarded moments, a realization began to form, one he resisted, yet could not fully escape, that in losing Sophia, he may have lost something far more valuable than he had ever understood. The restoration project reached its completion with a quiet significance that resonated far beyond architecture. The building stood renewed, its history preserved, its purpose redefined, and its presence transformed into something meaningful once again. Sophia stood within it during the final inspection, not overwhelmed by pride, but grounded in a deep sense of fulfillment. This was more than a project, it was proof of what could be rebuilt when care, patience, and intention were applied without compromise. It was after this moment that Richard Jackson's presence in Sophia's life shifted from professional to personal. There was no dramatic confession, no sudden change, only a gradual, honest conversation that acknowledged what had already been growing between them. Richard spoke with clarity, not about his position or power, but about respect, partnership, and the rare connection he had found in her. Sophia listened, not with hesitation, but with understanding. This was not something built on illusion or need, it was steady, considered, and real. Their decision to move forward together was met with attention, but unlike before, Sophia was not affected by public perception. She entered this new chapter with calm certainty, not as someone seeking validation, but as someone who had already found her worth. Their marriage, though widely recognized, remained grounded in mutual respect and shared values. It was not defined by status, but by balance, something Sophia had once hoped for, and now finally experienced. Without force or urgency, her life had taken a direction no one, especially Timothy, could have predicted. The news reached Timothy not as a rumor, but as a confirmed reality that could not be dismissed or reshaped. Sophia Robinson was now married to President Richard Jackson. For a long moment, he simply stared at the screen, reading the headline again and again as if repetition might change its meaning. It wasn't just the marriage that unsettled him, it was everything it represented. The same woman he had dismissed, reduced, and walked away from with certainty had rebuilt her life into something far beyond what he had imagined possible. For the first time, Timothy allowed himself to revisit the past, not selectively, not with justification, but with clarity. He remembered Sophia's quiet strength, her consistency, the way she had supported him without demanding recognition. He began to see what he had once overlooked, that her value was never something that needed to be proven. It had always been there. The words he had spoken during their final moment returned to him with full weight, no longer sounding like confidence, but like a failure to understand what he had in front of him. Around him, everything felt different now. Helen's presence, once sharp and controlled, had grown distant as his influence declined. Conversations between them had lost their alignment, replaced by tension and unspoken dissatisfaction. The life he had chosen, built on image and perception, no longer felt secure. And in that quiet realization, Timothy understood something he could not undo, that he had not only lost Sophia, but had misjudged her in a way that revealed more about his own limitations than hers. For the first time, regret was not just a feeling, it was a truth he could no longer escape. Time moved forward, but for Timothy Collins, it no longer carried the same certainty it once did. The world he had carefully built, measured by influence, recognition, and control, had shifted into something far less stable. Opportunities that once came easily now required justification, and respect that was once automatic had to be earned again. Helen Walter, sensing the decline, had already begun distancing herself, her presence fading as quietly as it had once entered. What remained around Timothy was not the powerful image he had protected, but the reality of choices he could not reverse. Sophia Robinson, now standing beside President Richard Jackson, lived a life that was no longer defined by struggle or recovery, but by balance and purpose. She had not become someone new, she had simply become fully herself, without compromise or limitation. Her work continued to reflect depth, her presence carried quiet confidence, and her life moved forward without the need to revisit what had been left behind. She did not seek to prove anything, nor did she look back in resentment. What she had rebuilt was not just her career or her status, it was her sense of self, something no one could diminish again. And in the quiet contrast between their lives, the truth became undeniable. The words Timothy had once spoken with certainty, "No one will want to marry a second-hand used woman like you," no longer held any power except as a reflection of who he had been in that moment. They did not define Sophia, they revealed him. What he had dismissed had risen, what he had overlooked had become extraordinary, and what he had lost could never be reclaimed. In the end, there was no dramatic confrontation, no final exchange, only the quiet, unchanging reality that some mistakes do not return for correction, and some truths arrive only when it is far too late. And that brings us to the end of today's story. The world of luxury often hides stories deeper than what meets the eye. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating stories on luxury true life stories. Until our next story, take care and stay tuned for more.